From dragon lairs to ancient temples, a typical campaign involves a lot of dungeons. It is in the name of the game, after all. But designing the rooms, traps, and encounters your players face while dungeon delving can be challenging, especially if you're just starting out. For this video, I'll give you some tips that I use whenever I'm designing dungeons that are both fun and challenging for my players. Without further ado, let's get started. In D&D, truly anything can be a dungeon. Over the course of a campaign, your players might have to explore ancient ruins, maddening mazes, wizard labs, and beholder lairs. No matter what dungeon you're designing, the first thing you need to do is figure out the theme of the dungeon. For a lot of your dungeons, this shouldn't be too hard. If you're designing a dragon's lair, then your dungeon should be themed around that dragon and its abilities. But for something like an ancient wizard's laboratory, that might be a little tougher. What did that wizard study? Why is the lab abandoned? What would they have needed to live here? You want the dungeon to feel like an extension of whatever creature or culture created it, not a mishmash of random ideas. Once you've established your theme, you should be making sure that all of your rooms, traps, and encounters fit with that vision. If your Lich's Lair has a strong undead theme, then why is there a puzzle here based around plants? Or if you're building a literal dungeon beneath a military fortress, what sorts of guards could your players encounter? Establishing a strong theme first will help your dungeon feel coherent and make it stand out against all the other ones you end up throwing at your party. Any fan of The Legend of Zelda can tell you that part of what makes the series so successful is its dungeons. Spanning all sorts of games and mechanics, Zelda's dungeons are often full of really creative puzzle solving and plenty of different enemy types. But one thing these dungeons do really well is give the player multiple pathways. There's no one right way to approach a dungeon. You might go down different paths, unlock certain places with keys in different orders, double back and find that your new tool now unlocks an area you couldn't reach before. Your dungeons in D&D can do the same thing for your players. Making choices is an integral part of what makes the game fun. And though good dungeons can be linear, it's often good practice to give your party multiple pathways they can follow. Even having just one fork in the dungeon or a couple of choices for where they can go next can keep your players thinking and keep them engaged at the table. One really easy method for offering branching pathways is to have one central hub in your dungeon that the other paths all start from. The order they tackle each path in is totally up to them, and you have a super easy way of keeping everything mapped in your head. You don't need to go overboard, but honestly, how else are they going to split the party if you don't give them the chance to? One thing that can help you when you want your dungeon to have multiple paths and branches is to structure it into different levels. Whether it's the floors of a castle or the layers of a subterranean cave system, splitting your dungeon up into chunks will help you keep track of all the different pathways that you're crafting without all those possibilities becoming too overwhelming. Instead of having to keep track of all the paths your players could be heading down at any given time, you only really need to worry about a few and how all of those different paths interact with each other. Once you have your different sections mapped out, then you can start to connect them in really fun ways. Sure, you could simply have a staircase that goes from one level to the next. Or maybe the party comes across a rope bridge and below them is a horde of skeletons waiting on the level below. Now they have a choice to make. Do they drop in and fight the skeletons or try to push forward on the level they're on and see if they can find a safer way down? Of course, you can also lock levels away behind closed doors, forcing your party to explore the level that they're on thoroughly to find whatever key they need to advance. How you connect them is up to you, but separating your dungeon into layers will make running them easier for you and give you options to make it feel even more dynamic for your party. One of the best parts of designing a dungeon is filling it with deadly traps and clever puzzles to keep your players on their toes. There is a very fun, if a little sadistic, joy in capturing your players in that perfect sticky situation. That said, you don't want your traps to feel cheap, like your players had no choice of avoiding them. And the last thing you want is for your players to struggle with a puzzle that only has one really convoluted answer. Leaving your traps and puzzles open-ended will help keep the game fun and your players thinking. When your traps are so hidden or deadly that your players can't react to them, it robs them of the chance to use their spells and abilities to help each other. And with puzzles, letting them figure out their own solution to whatever you throw at them will be much more satisfying than forcing them into just one way to go. So don't get too obsessed with your own solutions and trap ideas. Let your players figure out how to move forward. To that end, there's a reason lots of classic dungeon traps are so popular. Things like pit traps, swinging axes, and dart shooting walls are very obvious to your players, and that's what makes them fun. Every character will deal with these traps in different ways, giving your players a chance to really flex all those cool spells and abilities that they've been sitting on. Don't shy away from using popular dungeon traps just because you think they'll be cliche. In truth, a lot of people playing D&D, especially first-timers, want that classic D&D experience. Well-loved doesn't mean bad, so toss a falling rope bridge into your next dungeon. Believe it or not, most players don't actually want their characters to die, despite how they might act sometimes. When you throw them into a dungeon crawl where they're having to use their spells and powers at every turn, they're going to look for every opportunity to heal up, replenish their skills, and get a long rest. That can be a big problem if you're trying to challenge your players. Having them sleep right before the final boss will make it way easier of a fight than if they came in without all of their tools and tricks. And let's be honest, it also kind of ruins the narrative tension that you're building toward. Imagine if, after sneaking and gunning his way through Cloud City, Luke took a really quick nap before fighting Darth Vader. There are lots of ways you can keep your players from sneaking and a rest in your dungeons, or at least make it more of a risk. Hordes of monsters that wander the dungeon attacking anyone in a sleeping bag is a classic way to cover rest, but you can get creative with it. Maybe the necromancer placed a curse on his tower, causing anyone who sleeps inside to have terrible nightmares that cause them to wake with a level of exhaustion, provided they fail their wisdom save. Or it's so cold in the Frost Giant's castle that trying to stop and sleep gives you cold damage by the time you actually manage to get up. Sometimes they'll be clever or lucky enough to rest anyway, but make sure you've at least given thought to keep your dungeon from being steamrolled by players who know when to take a good nap. Those are some tips that will hopefully help you design better dungeons for your D&D campaigns. At the end of the day, this game is all about having fun, and nobody knows your party better than you. So fill your dungeons with dastardly traps, zany encounters, punishing puzzles, whatever you know they'll enjoy. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you're able to use some of these ideas at your own table. If you have your own tricks for putting together fun and exciting dungeons, let me know in the comments. I'm always really happy to hear what you have to say. And if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate if you'd leave a like and consider subscribing to the Bard's College. I make content all about D&D and DMing, so if that's your thing, I always appreciate the support. But for now, good luck, and remember, crit your players.